Hello and welcome to The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer and I run the Production Advice website, where my aim is to help you get the best results recording, mixing and mastering your music. And this week I have a guest. It's a little off topic for mastering, but if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that I like to head off the beaten track every now and again. This episode, my guest is Tim Exile, who has created an amazing music collaborative jamming online app thing called Endless with three S's, which I mentioned briefly at the end of the last episode talking about remote audio collaboration. And basically, I'm just so excited about the application that I just wanted to get Tim on to talk about it and help spread the word about it. So, Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and talk to your followers. It's great. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. I mean, thanks for coming on the show. It's you probably don't know this, but I'm a bit of a Tim Exile fan. I discovered you through Imogen Heap way back when I think you were touring with her on the Ellipse tour, and she shared some amazing live stuff that you did. And I saw you at TEDx in Aldborough and a few other places. And I was just kind of amazed. So I thought it'd be interesting to start off by talking about how you got started, because you started out as a live performer, right? Doing looping.
It depends where you kind of drop the start point anchor.
We'll go back further if you want.
Well, I mean, I do have a bit of a sort of like set piece, my story thing, which I'll try and whistle through. And it does kind of set the context of what I think it explains why things happened the way they did. So my first musical experience was playing the violin. I picked that up at about age, I think it was 4 or 5 when I started playing the violin. And apparently my mum tells me it's the first thing that I ever said yes to. When someone said, do you want to play the violin? And she thought my answer would be no, because it was no to everything else. So there was clearly something about it that I really wanted to do. Flash forward to, me as an early teenager, and I fell in love with electronic music. Listening to the rave tapes that were circulating from, the early rave scene of the late 80s, early 90s. And I totally fell in love. I mean, the moment I heard that stuff, I was in a different universe. And I knew that I wanted to make my life about something to do with that sound world. But, as having had that first experience of playing the violin, I thought that electronic music was something very embodied. It was something that was played and performed and improvised. But of course it wasn't. It kind of, especially at that time, it was the complete opposite. That was just when DAWs were coming in, just when sort of, multi-track, software editing, and all that music was very designed. It was very much kind of like come up with an idea, draw it out on the screen, listen to how it sounds, iterate on that. And it was all very much about perfectionism.
Did that disappoint you when you kind of discovered that? I mean, did you kind of hear the music and want to get into it and then think, oh, actually?
I don't know. I think I was too young to be disappointed. My cortex was still forming. So I was very much like, oh, okay, well, that's the way it is. Well, I'll get into that then. I DJed for about a year, maybe even less, until I got it. It wasn't as hands-on enough. I was used to, the really complex finger technique for violin and so on, and DJing didn't cut that what I wanted. So I then very quickly got into producing, which did give me a certain degree of nerdery to really kind of dive down deeply. I mean, it wasn't an embodied deep diving, it was a very cerebral deep diving, but it still, it ticked that deep dive box. That kind of took me right the way through to sort of my early, my first releases, my first radio play, producing music. And I was very much into making absolutely exquisite bits of, trying to make absolutely exquisite, over-engineered bits of music that would, where you'd spend like 100, 200 hours making a 5-minute piece of music. And with details that no one would ever appreciate apart from me. And then I sort of burnt out from that at some point. And I was just like, that's, I missed that original violin kind of like bow on string, move your body, sound happens kind of experience. And I wanted to bring that to electronic music. And I'd been, as a deep diver, I'd been messing around with like Native Instruments Reactor, and various other kind of early digital modulars, beginning to kind of understand how DSP works, how programming works, really, how to handle events and audio in the digital world. As my production chops grew, so did my programming chops grow. And I just started getting more and more ambitious with the things that I was making. And
was it mainly sounds that you were developing, or were you kind of getting into the whole like literally modular synthesis of kind of loops and all that kind of stuff?
The thing that I was most interested, first of all, was sample manipulation. So taking recorded sounds and then manipulating those, but that very quickly led to I guess kind of live looping and live sampling and live processing. Basically anything. I think I was like anything that would allow me to do stuff then and there, to be responsive and immediate and spontaneous. There's also a heavy kind of, I guess what you call nowadays UX. But it was, UX I don't think really even existed in the early 2000s, or maybe it did somewhere. But this idea of, it's not just design, not just interface design. It's like how you interact with something. I started building tools where they would just directly map to MIDI controllers, and I'd actually say I'd take a certain MIDI controller and figure out like how can I make a piece of an instrument or something for this controller. So almost like developing the software and the mapping at once, which I think is, the way to make really performable instruments.
The thing that I often think of when I look at what you were doing live then and now with Endless is the Chaos Pad. But was this prior to that bit of tech coming out, or was that one of the toys you were playing with?
So my first setup did actually use a Chaos Pad as a MIDI controller. So I did get a Chaos Pad, I think when it came out, it was like 2000, maybe 99, 2000, around that time. And yeah, it was super fun. I mean, this was like when I was at university, and we'd sort of sit up late at night with the TV, watching like really trashy TV and smoking weed and putting it through the Chaos Pad and like resampling applause and then like putting applause over stupid bits of TV. But that fun, that immediacy and that fun was really attractive. Yeah, I suppose it's funny actually. I think the Chaos Pad was actually very influential in kind of opening my eyes to what good, almost like kind of parallel development of DSP and interface, kind of hardware interface mapping.
Because I think it just struck me as it's the thing I love about Endless, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that it's really, really intuitive. And I think the Chaos Pad as well, just this kind of thing of like, you basically, anything with knobs and dials, you can just grab hold of it, you just move things around. Like you say, it's the physical thing influencing the sound and you responding to what it does. And I guess, when I first saw you, you had a huge sort of, I guess it was a big flat flight case. Maybe it was a mixing desk flight case or something, just basically full of pedals and mixers and all the rest of it, all kind of wired together and mashed together to create this kind of performance rig. And I know that after that, you kind of got into designing some plugins that were basically kind of instruments and DSP kind of tools. I admit that I lost track a little bit of what you were up to at that point, just because I'm not a performer. One of the things I love about Endless is it made me start actually making music again. But again, we'll come on to that in a second. Yeah, I guess because I wasn't making music at that point. I've dabbled in electronic music stuff in the past, but so the idea of, it's another synth or sampler manipulation thing or whatever kind of didn't interest me as much. But then, I don't know, maybe just a few months ago, I saw something from you, a tweet, I think it was, kind of saying that you used to go on stage with 40 kilos worth of gear. And now you go out with an iPhone. And that kind of caught my attention. I was like, what's he talking about there? Because obviously I remembered the 40 kilos of kit. And, I was intrigued to see what that was about. And obviously the answer was Endless, which is this app that allows you to live loop, and it's an instrument and it's also a sampler and it's a collaboration tool. But was it an organic thing going from performing with this big rack of kit through developing plugins into Endless, or was it just, how did that happen? How did that work?
It was fairly organic. Oh, it was certainly very kind of overlapped, but there were certain key moments. So the plugins, so the Flow Machine, which is this big flight case of kit which you talk about, which is still exactly the same as the one that I use today. When I go out and do live shows, I do live shows with exactly the same rig that I did 10 years ago.
Okay.
Which is, I mean, there's a whole other podcast about, building and learning to play instruments, the importance of keeping an instrument the same. Anyway, I'll leave that for another day. So a lot of the DSP inside the Flow Machine has, some of it has become products. I teamed up with Native Instruments to turn little blocks of the Flow Machine, which was all built in Reactor. It was all one huge sprawling Reactor ensemble.
Okay.
So the Finger, which is the first plugin I did with Native Instruments, was literally lifted straight out of the Flow Machine. It's an effects unit, but where you trigger each effect on a key on a keyboard, and also there's a kind of fancy routing thing where it sort of routes the effects in the order that you trigger them on the keyboard, so you can kind of reroute things live. It's pretty bonkers. And then came the Mouth, which is also another thing that I built for the Flow Machine, which is a kind of voice-activated synth. And all of these are still available on Native Instruments if you want to explore them. Some of them are available incomplete as well. Anyway, so those are the plugins, and they came around the same time as sort of my peak kind of touring with the Flow Machine. There are a few key points. Going from me as an artist playing the Flow Machine, which was just for me, to Endless, and I think the first one was realizing that the potential of what I had in the Flow Machine was much bigger than just one artist playing this thing, and that it had potential to kind of bring unlock a different kind of creativity for a lot of people, more than just me. And then there were quite a few sort of aborted attempts at how to do that. I just looked into trying to do it as a plugin with Native Instruments, but a plugin was a bit too limiting for what I really wanted to do with it, because it involves so much MIDI mapping, etc. And then I looked at basically like talking to Behringer, who sort of recently slightly disgraced themselves, but teaming up with them to do some kind of hardware unit, because most of my controllers are hardware, and obviously that's a hugely complex thing. After a while, basically realized that the only way to go about this was to basically start a company, team up with some developers, designers, engineers, and just build this thing, firstly as a code base from scratch, with this kind of the core kind of Flow Machine workflow at the heart of it. And then kind of in that process, the way that it works collaboratively just kind of opened up really naturally, because it was always kind of quite implicit in the workflow that this could actually be multiplayer. The way Endless works now is this kind of loop station / kind of chat room system.
Yeah, let's talk about exactly what it is quickly, just for anybody who's listening who hasn't kind of checked it out yet. So there are two versions, or they're going to be two versions, because it's going to be released as a plugin soon. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the current version that anybody can get now is available on any Apple, any iOS device. It's an app that you download to your phone, and it's basically a live looping app. So it's got kind of drum machines and synths in there, and you can build a loop and set it up. And then you can layer those loops on top of each other to kind of create what you call riffs with 3 Fs. And you can kind of sequence those together in development. But the really, I think, groundbreaking thing about it is that if somebody else is connected to you in a jam session on another iOS device, which could be sitting next to you or it could be on the other side of the world, as soon as you hit the button that says loop what I just did, they hear the result of what you just did, and it updates in their copy of the app. So you can basically exchange musical ideas with each other, right? Because you could do a beat and I could play a bass line over the top of it, and you would hear my bass line, and then you could add some processing to the bass line and I would hear the processing, and I could go back and edit my own drum beat or your drum beat or whoever's drum beat it was in the first place. And the whole thing can kind of evolve, and you can have many people as part of the same jam session at the same time. And it's this kind of wonderful sort of collision of tech and creativity where, mistakes kind of generate new ideas. And I mean, I think the cleverest thing about it is the fact that, it's because it's not really live in the sense that, not like a real jam session where people are literally playing along in time with each other, but it feels as though it's live because it's so interactive. And yeah, you're saying that interactive element was there from the beginning, or just kind of was obvious that it'd be silly to leave it out, or what was the thought process?
Well, there was a bit of a kind of like road to Damascus moment. So Ash, who is our incredibly talented, who's amazing kind of force of nature, super developer guy, who's right at the core of build. He's our chief engineer. He was the first guy who came on board. So we spent a year, me and him, working together. Where he was kind of building stuff in Reactor, actually. So we had a pretty extensive Reactor prototype of Endless, actually mapped to Ableton Push 1, which is nicely circular because now we've got Endless Studio, which is mapped to Ableton Push 2. One day we were kind of like working together side by side on various different things, and he had his Ableton Push, which had this whole history of riffs in it. And I had my Ableton Push running on my version of Reactor that had my riffs in it. And Ash was just playing me through some of the stuff he did. And he's got this amazing, quite sort of perverse musical mind that's just like hilarious and quite brilliant. And I was just like, oh man, I really want your history on my version of well, it wasn't even called Endless at the time. I can't remember what we were calling it, but I wanted to have his stuff. And then that in that moment the penny dropped. They're just like, I think as soon as I said that, I kind of paused and did a whole like 50 steps ahead into the future. I was just like, what we could make this. We could totally make basically what Endless is now by having this kind of shared real-time synced database of riffs.
Yeah, well, and a shared history as well, like you say, because that's the other thing is that another wonderful thing about Endless is you kind of, you lose a couple of hours jamming in it and then think, I really should go to bed. And then you can come back in the morning and just go back and kind of pick out every iteration of because it's, it's built over these riffs, which are these kind of short looping segments, and it could be 4 bars or 8 bars or however many, and you can choose the key and the time signature. But then each riff has 8 layers. Which initially is just the stuff that builds up, and then people start combining different layers and processing them, so it all gets horribly, wonderfully complicated. But yeah, the other great thing is you can go back into the history, and so I mean you can undo mistakes because you can resurrect a previous riff, or you can go further back, and I mean if you're clever you can pull ideas out of previous versions and bring them back into the current version. It is amazingly flexible. I mean, how about the idea of the layers and all the rest of it? That was there to begin with, I guess. Did that come from the live setup?
Yes, that came from the Flow Machine. So most of Endless is directly related to how the Flow Machine works. So to kind of dive into it a bit, you've got 8 slots. We've got 8 channels where loops can stack up. And when you make a loop, you don't make a loop into a specific one of those channels. It's just we have an algorithm just finds a free slot basically and just plonks it in there and shows you where it is. The idea of having like a single channel in where you loop stuff, and then it maps it to one of those layers is in there. The idea of being able to kind of route a number of those layers, like from one to all of those layers, into a single effects bus and then reloop that. That was a Flow Machine idea. So it's pretty much a sort of carbon copy of the core workflow from the Flow Machine,
and it just works so well. I mean it's amazing from a tech point of view, but I just think it's also, I don't know whether this is by accident or design, one of the things I like about it. So I'm not a musician. I'm musical. Obviously, I eat, drink, sleep, breathe music in my everything that I do. But I never put in my 10,000 hours or whatever it was to become a performer. I've played various things. I've dabbled in, doing loop-based stuff. But I would never feel comfortable to sort of go down to my local pub and would take a guitar and join in with a jam session, as much as that is an attractive idea to me. Or even kind of, part of some kind of electronic dubstep combo. Yeah, so I would never kind of take part in a live music jam session like that normally. But the great thing about Endless is that nobody hears anything that you do when you're fiddling around with ideas until you choose to hit the loop button. And for me, that's crucial because it takes away this feeling of self-consciousness of like, oh, I'm going to make a mistake. And I think this goes back to what you were talking about first, of that whole thing of music production being perfectionist. And it's got to the point I've even kind of hummed the odd melody, which nobody would ever persuade me to sing. But it's just like, well, if I can make a noise that basically fits what I'm hearing, I'm comfortable to share that. And it just kind of unlocks this whole creative bit of my brain, and I think everybody's brain, where it's inviting. It feels safe to join in and just mess around and do stuff. And it just leads in all these amazing directions. And yeah, I mean, so was that a goal that you had, or is that a kind of happy accident? How does it work?
It was a goal, absolutely. And I didn't really. It was definitely a moonshot. I think that side of it, wanting to make something that did as much as possible to kind of fence off all wormholes. Because I mean, with current production software, well, it is production software. I mean, that's the 95% of music tech. Well, we could probably, I think nowadays we can exclude modular and synthesizers and stuff like that, but still the mainstream of music tech is really about production, and production is about perfection. You're trying to produce a product that is like immensely palatable for people. So all those software products are kind of absolutely beset with like wormholes of editing and tweaking that you can fall down. And we wanted to do every single thing we could possibly do to kind of to fence all that stuff off. So this idea of like, you don't have to choose a channel. We wanted to remove all the admin. So if you play something, we don't want you to have to think about like, okay, is that channel record armed? We don't want you, like, if you play something good, we don't want you to miss a good bit. So this is why we have the retrospective looping. It's always recording into a buffer in the background. And when you've done something good, you just decide, okay, I'll commit that. It just takes, we wanted to remove as much of the fear, as much of that kind of, sort of fear of being exposed, or fear of like doing the wrong thing. And also, that, also the wormhole of like getting into editing, really. So,
and I think it's so successful at that. And it's interesting as you're talking, because I'm just thinking maybe that's one reason that I find it so appealing, is that my whole job is about perfectionism. It's like, if you're going to be a mastering engineer, perfectionism is a superpower. The ability to notice that click and to care about it, or to notice that bass resonance, or the fact that level doesn't quite match that one. It's kind of, it's built into everything that I do. So to have all of that stuff taken away is just so refreshing, and so much fun. And it has, I mean, I said to you in an email, it's got me making music again 20 years after. It feels like it did when I was a student, and we'd just go around to a friend's house, and, there was a copy of Cubase and a couple of, cheesy synths, and you just have a laugh. But amazingly, quite often you end up with these sort of really quite exciting musical ideas. I've got a kind of library, a history of riffs where I'm kind of thinking, well, that could become a track one day, perhaps. And actually, I just saw yesterday that the first album created with Endless has just been released. Isn't that right?
Yes, the Veltron transmissions. It's wonderful how that whole thing sort of came about, because it came back. It all came about very organically. And I think, you sort of seeded into this. It was really interesting how you seeded into this from, building up the history and building up your library, and then talking about how to then translate that library into basically some kind of like musical keepsake, which then itself turns into a kind of, an artifact in its own right that you actually build your own relationship with. It starts with just playing, and then the playing through the history is kind of elevated into some kind of like storytelling through the history. And then when you go back through the history, you then kind of like sift through this story, and you highlight certain elements of it. And then those highlights then get assembled into an album, like what the Veltron transmissions have made. And then that album then has its own life as a kind of completely separate kind of cultural artifact in its own right, which I think, like, for me, that is the most fascinating thing about Endless, because it really, it kind of does a 180 on the way we've learned to create and understand, well, art. Particularly music. That it's all about this kind of end result, and everything apart. The end result is this kind of like the tip of the iceberg, but you only ever see the tip of the iceberg, and everything beneath it is kind of irrelevant. Whereas Endless, it almost like turns the iceberg upside down. So the whole process is enjoyable and engaging, and is a story in its own right. And then from that story and from engaging in that process, you get something like the Veltron Transmissions album. I don't know.
I completely agree. It's so exciting because, well, one thing, just by the by, turns out I've been jamming with one of the members of the band in the Veltron Transmissions, Bad Rico, and I had no idea that he was so kind of deeply embedded into the Endless community. But I completely agree with you with the story as well, because I remember, I talked about making music when I was a student, and there was one occasion in particular where we were actually jamming and it was all just going down onto 4-track tape, and I decided there was a bird singing outside the window. So I hung a mic out of the window, and the bird song got recorded along with the track. And every time I hear that weird, strange jam session, I'm taken back to that time in my life. And the second or third day I was playing with Endless, it was a Saturday morning, and I just went out and I picked up an acoustic guitar for the first time in about 20 years and started playing single notes and looping single notes and building up patterns. And of course I was out in the garden and the birds were singing, and that's on there as well. And so that's going to be, that bit of music has become part of my history. And I agree with you. I just think that's wonderful. And it brings it to everybody, it makes it so much more accessible. And I guess that's a general thing about music tech, right? And smartphones and all the rest of it. And then the other thing is, yes, I've got all these ideas of things that could become, because the nice thing about Endless is you can export the layers and you could then bring them into Logic or Ableton or some other kind of music software and build an album or a finished piece of music from it. But actually, as far as I'm concerned, it's more fun to just go back in and jam with people. And I think, that's so great to have the performance aspect of it so attractive. Anyway, we need to talk about the Kickstarter, because yesterday, if I'm right, you launched your Kickstarter for Endless Studio, which is basically the same thing, but as a plugin that can be used in any piece of music software. So presumably, you can build up your own beats and play them straight through and kind of join in an Endless jam from a DAW. And also, I think, connect it to a hardware controller. Is that right?
Yes. So it's also a standalone app as well. So you'll be able to run it as standalone on your Mac or Windows device.
Okay, great.
If you want kind of really deep hardware mapping, you'll probably want to run the standalone version, just because the depth to which you can map or reliably map a VST plugin is, it's different between different DAWs. So there are certain limitations there, but not that many. You can still build a solid kind of DAW-based jamming workflow with the Endless Studio plugin. And then, of course, you've got, instead of just being limited to the sounds you've got within Endless, you've got all the plugins that you have. You've got all the kind of clips that you can launch and sample them and loop them into Endless, and then process them within Endless, and of course collaborate live from any DAW to any other. So you could be running Endless Studio as a plugin in Ableton. I could be running it as a plugin or the audio unit as a plugin in Logic. And then someone else could be running it in Cubase. And we could all be jamming together from 3 completely different DAWs. And also be able to kind of, drag riffs in and out, drop them in our timelines, or session view, and arrange them into tracks.
Which is fantastic, and is going to kind of address one of the main requests from the community, I think, which is people saying, when is this going to be available on Android? And I understand there are some kind of, Android is not nearly as good with audio as iOS, so there's lots of challenges in that. but this means that you won't actually need a device in order to get in on the fun.
Absolutely not. I mean, obviously, if you've got you need a Mac or a Windows laptop or desktop. But a lot of people, I think most people who engage in music creation have either one of those. So yeah, I think it's going to open us up to a much bigger audience, which is really exciting, and also maybe there's still a perception that making music on iOS devices is kind of niche. These perceptions always take some time. There's quite a long lag in those perceptions kind of falling away and people really getting into something. So I think the message that like we're on the same device that your Pro Tools rig is on, that your Ableton rig is on, that your Logic rig is on, will speak to people who basically like to take music really seriously.
See, and that's funny because that's the opposite of me, right? One of the things I love about the app is that it is just there on my phone. So I can literally, start doing something while I'm sitting in the garden, or, just 5 or 10 minutes here or there, whatever it is, rather than having to go back into the studio and power it all up and all the rest of it. I don't know whether you want us to include this in the podcast, but the Kickstarter has been fantastically successful already. You're almost at 3 times your goal, aren't you, after 2 days?
So we reached our funding goal in 1 hour and 1 minute, wow. Which was wonderful. I mean, it's really, it's really wonderful. We'd been doing a lot of work with the community beforehand and kind of building up to that moment. Yes, by the time I went to bed last night, we were well over 200% the funding goal. It's wonderful. It's really, really wonderful.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. So have you got any kind of timeline for it? I mean, it obviously already exists in one form or another. How long do you think before you'll be able to get it out into the world? Well,
we already have a very early prototype version that runs on macOS and is mapped to Ableton Push. And we've got this kind of high reward tier where you can get basically instant access to that within a couple of weeks of when the campaign ends, which is on the 2nd of July. So most people are pledging for the Endless Studio HD lifetime offer. So we've got Endless Studio, which is the app and the plugin. But then we've also got Endless Studio HD, which adds on a lossless audio, a kind of pro audio collaboration service on top of it, because the basic collaboration service is compressed. It's 192 kilobits per second, which is fine for when you're just jamming. But if you want to use it in a pro context, you want to have lossless audio. So that comes with Endless HD, which when we launch next year will be like $12 per month, £10 per month, because it's going to cost a lot in terms of servers. And so the most popular thing we're offering for our Kickstarter is a lifetime subscription to Endless Studio HD, which gives you lossless audio collaboration. It gives you a lossless history of everything you've done in your jams. It also gives you a sound library and some other benefits, such as you can design sounds on your desktop and then save those to your mobile device. So you can create your own sound packs, save them to your mobile device, for example. And that's the hot potato. That's the one to go for.
Will that be lossless audio on mobile devices as well, or is that only going to be for the desktop version?
It's account-based. It's not device-based. Once we ship all those features, and we're looking to ship the first kind of alpha versions of Endless Studio, at least for macOS, in December this year. And we'll be shipping Windows from February next year. We're not sure exactly when we'll have all the infrastructure for this kind of account-based thing, as in being able to access your lossless audio across all your devices based on your account. But that'll be coming around the same time, sort of late this year, early next year.
Fantastic. And I'll just have hope that the internet has recovered from the lockdown at that point, so that there's actually enough bandwidth to move the audio about.
Yes.
Something we didn't mention is just the community. It's, I think the fact that the Kickstarter got funded so fast is just a testament to the enthusiasm for the people who've kind of come together around the app. And it's so great sort of talking to people on, because there's a chat feature built in. So the ability to kind of just little conversations with people who you're jamming with or connecting with them on Discord, that must be inspiring.
It's great. It's wonderful, and it's a shame it's a lockdown, really, because I sort of want Endless to spill out into the real world a little bit. And I like, when the campaign ends on the 3rd of July, I really, we've got this office that that we don't use right now because it's a lockdown. And I just really want to get a whole bunch of like the most dedicated Endlessers together for a proper rave.
Well, listen, thanks so much for telling us about it. I mean, I think anybody listening can tell how excited I am about the whole idea. I do encourage anybody listening to head over to, where's the best place to go, Tim?
So if you head to studio.endless.fm, and then there's a link there that says back us on Kickstarter, and you can find our Kickstarter page. You can also, if you go straight to Kickstarter, kickstarter.com, and search for Endless with 3 S's, you'll find us. And actually, I think in the sound category, we're the top trending project at the moment, which is really cool.
And of course, anybody can head over, if you haven't already played with Endless and I'm curious to find out more, to get the app on the Apple App Store for iPhones and iPads. Is it still free to sign up?
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely free to sign up. There's a very substantial free tier. We don't really want to engage in this kind of like heavy upselling, basically telling you we've got some free product, then we haven't really at all. I know that there's a lot you can do on the free tier. And of course there is a subscription tier for the mobile as well. It's $4.49 per month. And that gives you way more sounds, way more effects, and also gives you infinite access to your history. It's compressed audio history, but it's infinite access. Encourage you to support us like that also, if you can. Yeah, so we have links at endlesswith3s's.fm.
Okay, actually, sorry, why 3 S's? What's the history of that?
Well, try getting endless with 2 S's .anything. It's pretty tricky. We wanted to kind of differentiate ourselves somehow, and also it's a bit of a pun. Endless. It goes on and on and on, and like the T-shirt that we're including in the merch in the Kickstarter campaign is actually the Endless logo, which again is 3 S's, which looks quite cool. 3 S's inside of a circle, made up of, it just says Endless, and it's got hundreds, maybe even 1,000 S's that make up the Endless logo. I don't know. It's just a bit of fun, isn't it?
It's fantastic. The whole thing is fantastic. Thank you for making it.
I just have to shout out to the team. I mean, but particularly the engineering team, the devs, because the whole team has made huge sacrifices and huge commitments to make this happen. It's kind of a technical behemoth, and given how many people we are, we're there's one, Ash is full time, and then we've got three other guys, Adam, Matt and Ragnar, and they're sort of fitting it in part-time around stuff. So I think it's incredible what we've achieved, and I always want to take the opportunity to big up the team and say thank you, because it's, they built it. I mean, I built the prototypes, and then, I guess my job these days is to kind of build the company and the brand and the message and all that kind of stuff, which I never, ever thought I'd get into, but here we are. But in terms of the tech, yeah, just massive props to the team.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thanks again for coming on the show. Really enjoyed talking to you, and keep up the good work. I'm going to be watching with interest to see where all of this goes.
Well, thank you, and thank you, and thank you.
And thanks to John for mixing and editing the episode, as always. Thanks to Kaylee Law for letting us use his music. And thanks to you for listening.